Have you ever done something crazy? Something totally unexpected, uncommon, outrageous, bizarre, wild? What's the craziest thing you've ever done, besides perhaps your choice of spouse? Or decision to have children or membership in the United Methodist Church? That's all too easy. What's the craziest thing you've ever done? If you're having a hard time really coming up with anything, don't feel real bad. Most of us rarely do anything that could be termed particularly wild and crazy. I mean, if anything, most of us spend the great majority of our lives trying to get the craziness out of our lives, right? What's the old saying? You know that you are truly all grown up when you ask where the action is so that you can go somewhere else. Most of us rarely, if ever, do anything that could be termed particularly crazy, wild, unusual, unexpected. Quite the opposite. We seek to avoid such things. Well, this is what I'd like to talk about this morning, and in fact, this is the whole premise of my sermon today. And one of the biggest problems in our lives is that we don't do enough crazy stuff. Today, we're going to look at one of the craziest people of all time, a person who also happens to be one of the greatest people of all time. This morning, we resume our series looking at great people from the Old Testament. Each week, another little character snapshot. And these individuals presenting us with kind of an overview of the whole story of the people of Israel, the foundation of our faith in Jesus Christ. This morning we pick things back up with Abraham. Abraham being an extremely important individual for every person of faith to know. Not only because of the great example of his faith, arguably the model of all true faith, but also quite simply because, particularly in these very tense and trying times in our world, he is still a key figure. Abraham, more commonly referred to as Father Abraham, is, as we noted a few weeks ago, the father of the three major world religions today. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all trace their roots back to this one man. We are all joined in Abraham, one family, a crucial person to understand. And quite appropriately to current world tensions, his story begins with Abraham residing in Haran, which is roughly modern-day Syria. And again, as we noted a few weeks back, he had originally lived in a place called Ur of the Chaldeans, which is approximately Kuwait today. But his father had moved the family out to what we know as Iraq, headed toward Canaan, which is Israel, eventually settling instead in Haran. Abraham's father has now died. Abraham has a wife, Sarah, and the key thing to know about their relationship being that Abraham and Sarah are childless. Sarah is barren, unable to conceive. It's just about the worst thing that could happen to a couple, and particularly to a woman in the culture of that time. This being central to all that follows. Well, one day God comes and speaks to Abraham, and this is where the whole story of the people of Israel begins. We don't know how or where this occurred. We don't know how Abraham knew that it was the Lord speaking. But what we do know is that God comes to Abraham, and then Abraham knows it's God, and God says to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." God comes with this dramatic calling, a great promise, but also a profound challenge. Basically, get up and leave your home and go to a new place, and I will bless you there, give you offspring, make of you a mighty nation, and through you bless the whole world. A dramatic call. What will Abraham do? What would you do? Verse 4. So Abraham went as the Lord had told him. Such a simple little statement told in such a matter-of-fact fashion, almost like, no big deal. This in direct contrast to what a monumental decision this actually is, and that's exactly the point, you see, to get our attention, to emphasize just how bizarre this is. Abraham, as the text sets it up, just gets up and goes. Once again, we don't know all the particulars of this, what exactly motivated him. A desire, perhaps to fulfill his father's unfinished journey, dissatisfaction with where he is, the hope of a better life, a simple willingness to obey. But whatever, it's clear that it's a fairly crazy move. Leave home and family and business to head out to some unspecified place to receive an unclear blessing and to be used in some undisclosed way. Get real. But Abraham went. It's a crazy move. And this is what I'd like to look at today. That this is what first sets the whole drama of salvation in motion. In fact, without this, the whole story of God's work of salvation through the people of Israel never would have gotten going in motion. Abraham does a very crazy thing, and that's the first great lesson of his life. That to find life, real life, it often takes a little craziness. Sometimes it takes a whole lot of craziness. To put it another way, the story of Abraham, the story of the people of Israel, is the story of God seeking to work blessing for all creation. This is what God wants for Abraham and for the world and for each of us. Overwhelming blessing. And the first lesson we get here is that taking hold of this requires a certain level of craziness. So what does this actually mean for us? Well, I'd like to look at a couple of the qualities of Abraham's actions here and what they say about how we are called to be crazy in order to truly receive life and the full blessings of the Lord. Three aspects in particular that I believe we are meant to take hold of here. First, Abraham leaves his security. God's command to Abraham begins very bluntly. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house. Notice the first two words. Go from. God pulls no punches. The first thing Abraham has to do is leave. Specifically, leave country, kindred, and home. He has to leave, to go away from all those things that not only most of us hold most dear, try to hang on most tightly to, but even more, he has to leave those very things that we hold dear exactly because they give us security and safety and stability amidst all the turmoil of life. That is, God commands Abraham first to leave things he probably most cherishes, the sure things, the safe things. This being commanded not being simply to be cruel, but rather it seems because this is where life is. Where I am calling you, God says in effect, and where you need to go, where life is truly found, real blessing, my fullest blessing, is only out beyond all those things. To put it another way, God tells Abraham first that he has to leave those things that give him security and safety. He has to leave his comfort zone. And this, I believe, is the first lesson for us here, that the first crazy thing that we often have to do if we ever really want to find life is we have to be willing to leave our comfort zone. You know, the Bible is filled with people whom God asked to do exactly this, to step out from the safe location, the sure deal, the life they were comfortable with and had settled into. God called Moses to lead the people out of Egypt, and Moses was sure that there's no way that he could do this. But God said, I need you to step out of your comfort zone. Peter thought the ministry of the early church should only be to the Jews, but God appeared to him in a dream and said, I need you to bring the gospel to the Gentiles as well. I need you to step out of your comfort zone. When Paul, the Christian killer, was blinded by the Lord on the Damascus road, God went to a man named Ananias and said, I need you to go help Paul. And Ananias said, no way, Paul's been trying to kill me. I'm not going anywhere near this guy. But God said, I need you to step out of your comfort zone. In all these cases, and in so many others, life was only found by people willing to go beyond their own security, their safety, the known thing, to go beyond their comfort zone, to go beyond it for the Lord. This is where God called them. How is God calling us as a church there? How is God calling you personally there? How are we being held back from life and from a truly powerful faith because we won't go? Essentially, the first question here, what do we individually and collectively need to leave because we have become too settled here, too accepting, too comfortable, and life just isn't here? You know? Preacher King Duncan writes, what did you leave behind when you became a Christian? Anything? When God calls us to one life, God is also calling us away from the current one. You can't have both. There is no way to follow God's call if we insist on clinging to our old way of life. This is a fact that many people miss or avoid. Our churches are filled with people too settled to seek God's face, and thus they never experience great faith. Understand, Satan's masterpiece is not the prostitute or the bum or the murderer. It is the self-sufficient person who has made life so comfortable, who is adjusting so well to the world and life's living there, who only longs to be a little bit better and a little better off than he already is. This idea clashes with the American Christian view that security and stability and comfort are blessings from God, but they are not. In fact, security and stability and comfort often mask spiritual deadness. Understand, God continually calls us out of our comfort zones in order to build our character. And Duncan then continues. There was an item in Men's Health magazine some time back. It was a description of what an average man is like. And in case you're wondering, the average male is 5'9" tall and weighs 173 pounds. He's married, 1.8 years older than his wife, prefers showering to taking a bath, spends about 7.2 hours a week eating, does not know his cholesterol count, but it's 211, watches 26 hours and 44 minutes of TV a week, cries about once a month, 1/4 as much as Jane Doe, falls in love an average of 6 times in his life, eats his corn on the cob in circles, not straight across, and prefers a steak medium. He can't whistle by inserting his fingers in his mouth, prefers that his toilet tissue unwind over rather than under the spool, and he will not stop to ask for directions when he's in the car. Duncan concludes, now it's perfectly all right to be this, to be the average man or woman. It's just that if you want something more than this, something more than average, well then, you're going to have to leave your comfort zone. You're going to have to leave something of what you now are, and that's what God so often calls us to. And understand, this means more than just unwinding the toilet paper under, or even, heaven forbid, actually stopping to ask for directions. First crazy thing that Abraham does that brings him life and blessing, he leaves his comfort zone. He leaves home. What do we need to leave to find life? Second crazy thing that Abraham does is Abraham lets go of logic. As we continue to look at the craziness of Abraham's willingness to follow God's call, second thing one can't help but be struck with is simply the sheer illogic of it. I mean, think about it. There are a lot of very good reasons why not to go. First of all, from what we can tell, Abraham is a very prosperous individual. We're told he has possessions and slaves. We don't know what business he's in, but apparently he's doing fairly well. And as a businessman, Haran is a terrific place to be. It was a wealthy, cosmopolitan town. Abraham apparently is one of the movers and shakers there. He's got a sweet deal there, you know? Why leave? Particularly for the mess that is Canaan. Add to this the fact that Abraham is no spring chicken anymore. He's 75 years old. Sarah is 65 when the call comes. A reminder to us whenever we think that God is through with us or that it's too late to change, you know? And even further, if Abraham is putting any stock in God's promise of making him a nation, of giving him descendants, well, if it hasn't happened in the last 50 years of marriage, I don't think it's really going to happen now, right? Get real. Put it all together, and there's a lot of logic behind not leaving. There are a lot of good reasons Abraham could have offered for not going. It just doesn't make sense to go, right? Yet Abraham goes. He puts logic aside. It's not simply for wishful thinking, for pie in the sky, by and by, but rather it seems for the word of God, for the promises of God. That is, what God is calling Abraham to do doesn't make sense in any normal way. But Abraham, it seems, chooses to base his life on the promises of God rather than on his own wisdom and on the wisdom of the world. And in this, he becomes tremendously blessed. And this is the second great lesson for us here. That another way we are called to live crazy lives is that we are called to base our lives not simply on what makes sense to us, what is logical, but on what God has said, what God has commanded, and what God has promised. As it has been said, we are not called to a reasonable faith. We are called to a radical faith. Think about it. Most of what Jesus taught us to do does not make any sense at all. It is entirely illogical. Love those who hate you. Pray for those who hurt you. Forgive 70 times 7. Rejoice in persecution. It doesn't make any sense. Yet Jesus had said essentially, this is what I want you to do because this is where life is. You know, it's not reasonable, it's radical. Which are we? Which are we living more often, the wisdom of the world or the instructions of God? Simply put, Jesus was a radical. Are we? Maybe this is exactly the second reason why we never truly take hold of life and all its richest blessings. Because we insist on doing only what makes sense to us rather than what God said. We base our lives on our own reason, on the ways and the logic of the world, on human thought rather than on God thought, rather than on trying to live out the radical promises and commands of God. We're just too reasonable when we are called to be outrageous. We're too logical when we're called to be crazy. How are our lives, again, both personally and collectively, being held back from God's richest blessings because we're more concerned with doing what makes sense to us than with doing the wild stuff that the Lord has commanded? One counselor writes, not so long ago I spoke to a woman whose husband had abandoned her for a younger woman, leaving her with a very young child to raise. As she told me the story, she said, I guess I've forgiven him 1,000,000 times. I have forgiven him over and over again. And I replied, you'll probably have to forgive him 1,000,000 times more before this is over. That may not seem like a word of hope, but it is, for this is where life is found, in continually handing things over to God's ways. That's where life is found, in continually handing things over to God's ways. Are we doing this? How much are we not being radically blessed because we're not living the radical commands of the gospel, being radically giving, radically forgiving, making radical sacrifices, offering radical love? Preacher Bruce Larson, he tells the following true story. On the morning of Sunday, November 8, 1987, Irishman Gordon Wilson took his daughter Marie to a parade in the town of Inniskill in Northern Ireland. As Wilson and his 20-year-old daughter stood beside a brick wall waiting for English soldiers and police to come marching by, a bomb planted by IRA terrorists exploded from behind and the brick wall tumbled on them. The blast instantly killed half a dozen people and pinned Gordon and his daughter beneath several feet of bricks. Gordon's shoulder and arm were injured. Unable to move, Gordon felt someone take hold of his hand. It was his daughter, Marie. "Is that you, Dad?" she asked. "Yes, Marie," Gordon answered. He heard several people screaming. "Are you all right?" Gordon asked his daughter. "Yes," she said. But then she too began to scream. As he held her hand again and again, he asked if she was all right, and each time she said yes. Finally, Marie said, "Daddy, I love you very much." And those were her last words. 4 hours later, she died in the hospital of severe spinal and brain injuries. Later that evening, a BBC reporter requested permission to interview Gordon. And after Wilson described what had happened, the reporter asked, "How do you feel about the guys who planted the bomb?" "I bear them no ill will," Wilson replied. "I bear no grudge. Bitter talk is not going to bring Marie back." In the months that followed, many people asked Wilson, who later became a senator in the Republic of Ireland and who worked unceasingly for peace, how he could say such a thing, how he could forgive such a monstrous and painful act. And Wilson explained. He said, "I was hurt. I had just lost my daughter, but I wasn't angry. Marie's last words to me, words of love, had put me up on a high plane of love. And something said to me that if I ever stepped lower than that, then I would lose it all, including my daughter." Second crazy thing that Abraham does that brings him blessing. He lets go of logic in favor of living out the wildest commands of God. He does the outrageous. Will we? All of which brings us to third and finally, Abraham allows himself to be used by God. In all of this, of course, what this whole calling of God to Abraham ultimately comes down to is God's intention to use Abraham for something great. This is what it's really all about. Yes, God intends to give great things to Abraham personally, but even more in and through this, God plans to use Abraham's life greatly on behalf of others, on behalf of the whole world. As God says, "I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And in you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed." God is looking to use Abraham. And notice this comes at the most unexpected time, in a most unexpected way. It's a very unusual request. And it probably appears to others to be a very foolish thing to do. Now, undoubtedly, Abraham wrestled greatly with whether or not to agree with this. It's not reflected in the text, but no doubt, there had to be a lot of soul searching. But in the end, as the text wishes to emphasize, Abraham agreed. He ultimately agreed to be used by God, and used in a manner that was probably most unexpected, unplanned, and even bizarre. But he agreed, and in this he found life. And this is the final lesson for us all here. That this is the final crazy thing we are called to do. To be used by God. To be willing, and perhaps even eager, to be used greatly by God in some way, in some unexpected, unplanned, maybe even outrageous way. But just doing whatever God wants, whatever the consequences. Mother Teresa put it this way, as sort of a basic rule of life. She said, "Be all and only for the Lord. Let him use you without consulting you first." Be all and only for the Lord. Let him use you without consulting you first. This could almost be said to be the motto of virtually all the great people of faith in the Bible. To be on call, to let God set the agenda, to place our lives out of our control. Basically, living the kind of crazy faith that ultimately results in God's richest blessings. To strive simply to be people who are a blessing to others rather than people who receive blessing. To not be concerned with what we get out of all this, but only that somebody else gets blessed. Are we willing to do this? Christian author Dale Galloway writes, "Little Chad was a shy, quiet young boy. One day he came home and told his mother that for Valentine's Day, he would like to make a valentine for everyone in his class. And her heart sank. She thought, oh, I wish he wouldn't do that, because she had watched the children when they walked home from school. Her Chad was always behind them, the outcast, the excluded. They laughed and hung on each other, but Chad was never included. Nevertheless, she decided she would go along with her son, so she purchased the paper and the glue and the crayons, and for 3 solid weeks, night after night, Chad painstakingly made 35 valentines. Valentine's Day dawned, and Chad was beside himself with excitement. He carefully stacked up the valentines, put them in a bag, and bolted out the door. His mother decided to bake him his favorite cookies and serve them nice and warm with a glass of cold milk when he came home from school. She knew he would be disappointed, and maybe this would help ease the pain a little bit. It hurt her to think that despite all his effort and all of his caring, he probably wouldn't get any valentines in return, maybe even none at all. That afternoon, she had cookies and milk on the table waiting. When she heard the children outside, she looked out the window. Sure enough, there they came, laughing and having the best of time. And as always, there was Chad, alone in the rear. He walked a little faster than usual this day. She fully expected him to be in tears as soon as he got inside. His arms were empty, she noticed. Not a single valentine. And when the door opened, she choked back her tears. I have some cookies and milk for you, she said, trying to sound happy. But he hardly heard her words. He just marched right on by, his face staring straight ahead. All he could say was, not a one, not a one. And her heart sank. But then he added, I didn't forget a single one, not a one. Everybody got a valentine from me. And he was overjoyed at his accomplishment. And with that, his mother sat down realizing that all the time she had been seeking his blessing, he had been seeking only to be a blessing. And thus his life, despite all of its challenges, was filled with joy. And she felt the call to do the same. Someone once said, faith is not merely belief in some unprovable concept. It is living whatever outrageous life that belief calls you to. Could perhaps one of the greatest problems in our lives today be that we're too often just too sane, too reasonable, too respectable, and too much in control? The lesson of the story of Abraham, if you really want life, the real lesson, sometimes you have to be crazy. Do something outrageous for God this week and be outrageously blessed. Leave home, do the absurd, and be a blessing. Let us now prepare to celebrate the sacrament of our Lord.